Washington is retreating and Europe is holding the door shut. That is the only honest way to describe what is happening right now at the intersection of chip technology and data policy, and it is happening at a moment when the United States can least afford it. There are two things every advanced AI system needs to exist and to scale, and those two things are chips and data. And right now, a single region controls the critical choke points on both, and that region is Europe. And the tension building around that fact is no longer background noise, it is front-page geopolitics. Let us start with the hardware, because that is where the story becomes uncomfortable for Washington. There is a Dutch company called ASML, and most people outside the semiconductor industry have never heard of it, but almost everything that runs on a modern chip traces back to what this company makes, and the machines they build are not just important, they are irreplaceable. ASML is the only company in the world that produces commercial extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, and that single fact carries enormous weight, because without EUV machines, you cannot manufacture the most advanced chips on the planet. Full stop. Not the fastest processors powering AI data centers, not the chips inside the most advanced military guidance systems, not the semiconductors that TSMC uses to manufacture for Apple or Nvidia. None of it happens without ASML. The company holds more than 90% of the advanced lithography market and 100% of the EUV segment. That is not a dominant market position, that is a structural monopoly that took 30 years and billions of dollars and multiple near bankruptcies to build, and no competitor has come close. Now, here is where the story shifts. ASML just announced something significant, and the timing lands at exactly the wrong moment. For the United States, researchers at the company have successfully increased the power of the EUV light source inside their machines from 600 watts to 1000 watts. That sounds like an engineering detail, but follow the chain, and the implications become very large, very fast. More power in the light source means faster chip exposure, which means more wafers processed per hour, which means more chips coming off the same production line without building new factories. Right now, the best ASML machines process around 220 silicon wafers per hour, and by 2030, that number is projected to reach approximately 330 wafers per hour. That is roughly 50% more chip output from the same equipment. And since each wafer holds anywhere from dozens to thousands of chips, depending on the design, the practical impact on the global supply of advanced semiconductors is enormous. The lead technologist at ASML described this as a real and sustained engineering advance, not a demonstration and not a short-term performance. SPIC. The company is already mapping a path toward 1500 watts and sees no fundamental barrier to reaching 2000 watts, meaning the ceiling keeps rising while everyone else is still trying to match today's baseline. Now think about what this means for American chip makers. Intel has staked a significant portion of its recovery and its competitive future on the next generation of ASML machines called high-NA EUV systems. A single one of those systems costs somewhere between $350 million and $400 million per unit, and Intel needs them to manufacture chips below 2 nanometers. TSMC cannot produce its most advanced nodes without ASML systems, and neither can Samsung. Every high-end chip that powers NVIDIA GPU clusters, every processor running inside Google and Amazon and Meta data centers, every advanced semiconductor with military applications, all of them flow through production lines built around tools that only one Dutch company can supply. So when ASML upgrades its technology, The entire American tech supply chain feels it, and when access to those machines becomes a question of policy rather than just commerce, the strategic implications are immediate. Now, pause here for a second and tell us in the comments what you think gives a country more strategic leverage. In today's world, control over chip manufacturing equipment or control over data flows? Write your answer below, because the second half of this story is going to make that question a lot more interesting. Because chips are only the first dimension. The second dimension is data, and this is where Washington made a move that tells you exactly how nervous the situation has become. In February 2026, Reuters reported on a leaked internal diplomatic cable signed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, directing American diplomats at embassies around the world to actively lobby against foreign data sovereignty laws. The cable was dated February 18th, and the language was direct. Diplomats were told to push back against regulations that restrict how American technology companies collect, store, and move personal data across borders. The directive called these laws unnecessarily burdensome and described them as disrupting global data flows, raising costs, limiting AI and cloud services, and undermining civil liberties. And the document pointed specifically at Europe, and specifically at the GDPR, which is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. That is the legal framework that covers 450 million European citizens and sets strict rules on how companies handle personal data. Under the GDPR, companies must obtain explicit consent before collecting data. They must report breaches within 72 hours. They must protect data from unauthorized access, and they cannot freely transfer data to countries that do not meet European privacy standards. The directive from Rubio, calling this framework unnecessarily burdensome, is not a casual complaint. It is the United States government formally telling its diplomatic corps to spend political capital fighting Europe's privacy architecture on behalf of American tech platforms. And the reason Washington cares this much comes down to money and to AI training data. American technology companies have paid more than 5.88 billion euros in GDPR fines since the regulation came into force in 2018. That number keeps climbing. Meta received a 1.2 billion euro penalty in May 2023 for illegally transferring European Facebook user data to servers in the United States. Amazon was fined 746 million euros for tracking users without proper consent. LinkedIn was hit with 310 million euros in October 2024 for using member data to power targeted advertising without a valid legal basis. And this is not random enforcement. Out of the total GDPR fines issued as of early 2025, American companies absorbed 83% of the penalties. No other country comes close to that exposure level. The 2020 Schrems II ruling by the European Court of Justice made the situation structurally harder because that decision invalidated the previous framework for EU to US data transfers entirely. The court ruled that American surveillance law, specifically Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, authorities allowed US intelligence agencies to access data on non-Americans in ways that were fundamentally incompatible with European privacy rights. The connection to Snowden-era revelations was explicit. Programs like PRISM had demonstrated that if your personal data sat on American servers, American intelligence had a legal pathway to access it, regardless of your nationality or where the data was originally collected. That is the architecture that Europe built its sovereignty framework to resist, and that is the architecture Washington is now spending diplomatic resources trying to soften. Where are you watching from? Right now. Drop your country in the comments below. We want to see how far this conversation has traveled. Now step back and look at both dimensions together, because this is where the picture becomes sharp. The same partner that the United States depends on for access to the only machines capable of producing the world's most advanced chips is simultaneously building tighter legal walls around the data that American AI systems need to train and profit from. That is not two separate policy problems, that is a single compounding constraint. On the hardware side, every American chip maker from Intel to the foundries supplying NVIDIA relies on a technology ecosystem that is anchored in the Netherlands and more broadly in Europe, including German optical precision from Carl Zeiss and an 800 supplier network where European firms carry significant weight. On the data side, American platforms face an increasingly strict regulatory perimeter that limits how they can collect, monetize, and move European user data, and Washington's own diplomatic cables confirm that this constraint is being taken seriously at the highest levels of government. The Rubio Directive also reveals a policy contradiction that is hard to ignore. The United States spent years pressuring the Netherlands to restrict ASML's ability to sell its most advanced machines to China, particularly EUV systems, and the Netherlands ultimately complied, creating export controls that block Chinese chip makers from accessing the leading-edge equipment. China has responded by continuing to buy ASML's older DUV machines, and in 2025, China accounted for 33% of ASML's equipment sales by unit volume. That means Europe's most strategically important technology company still earns roughly a third of its revenue from a customer that Washington has been pressuring it to restrict. Europe is caught between two pressures. Washington wants tighter China controls and looser data rules simultaneously, and Europe's own interests do not align cleanly with either demand. France and Germany formally defined digital sovereignty as a pillar of national resilience. In November 2025, Finland launched a national civilian initiative in February 2026 called Digital Independence, warning that dependence on third-party digital infrastructure weakens national autonomy. The EU froze a major trade deal with the United States after Washington moved toward broader tariff escalation. France restricted US ambassador access to government structures. These are not isolated diplomatic gestures. They are signals that Europe is consolidating around the idea that its technology leverage is real and that it intends to use it. Now think through the scenario, because the facts point somewhere specific. If Europe slows ASML delivery timelines to American customers, or prioritizes other buyers, or simply uses its pricing power more aggressively, the effect on the American chip supply chain is not theoretical, it is direct and it is fast. Intel's roadmap to sub-2 nanometer chips depends on high-NA EUV machines arriving on schedule. Delays in access mean delays in production, which means Intel's domestic manufacturing ambitions fall behind, which means American dependence on TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea deepens. That is precisely the vulnerability the CHIPS Act was designed to reduce. The United States committed approximately $52 billion in chip subsidies through the CHIPS Act, and the European Union committed 43 billion euros through its own chip program. Those funds can build facilities, and train workers, but they cannot manufacture a competitor to ASML in any timeline that matters. 30 years of iterative engineering, hundreds of near-failure moments, and a global supplier network built to extreme tolerances cannot be replicated by a funding commitment. No matter how large the number on the check, ASML's chief technologist said the company sees a clear path to 1,500 watts and no fundamental reason it cannot reach 2,000 watts, which means while the hypothetical American competitor would be trying to replicate today's technology, ASML is already building tomorrow's, and the gap does not close, it compounds. This dynamic has historical echoes worth noting. During the Cold War, the United States used semiconductor export controls to deny the Soviet Union access to advanced computing technology, and the impact on Soviet military and civilian technological development was severe and long-lasting. The link between chip access and military capability is direct then and now. Advanced semiconductors power autonomous targeting systems, satellite communications networks, drone coordination platforms, and every other domain where the next conflict will be decided. The country that controls the machines that make the chips shapes the trajectory of every one of those systems. What makes the current moment different is that the leverage is inverted. In the Cold War, Washington held the export controls. Today, a Dutch company and a European regulatory framework are the choke points, and Washington is on the dependent side of the equation while simultaneously antagonizing the partner that holds those choke points. The Rubio Directive is evidence of how uncomfortable that position has become. You do not mobilize your entire global diplomatic corps to fight a privacy law because it is inconvenient. You do that because the financial and strategic exposure is large enough to treat as a national priority. And here is the core tension that defines the moment. The United States needs European cooperation on chip access to sustain its semiconductor advantage, and it needs European data openness to fuel the AI systems that will define the next decade of technological and military competition. But the political posture Washington has adopted treats European regulations as obstacles to be lobbied against rather than as sovereign frameworks to be negotiated around. France is blocking ambassador access, trade deals are frozen, GDPR enforcement keeps accelerating, and ASML keeps upgrading its technology while the roadmap to any credible alternative remains measured in decades, not years. The chips are still flowing for now. The data is still moving for now, within contested legal frameworks. But the conditions for a real supply constraint are assembling, and the window to recalibrate the relationship before those constraints become operational is narrowing. Here is the question that defines the next few years. When the two most critical inputs for artificial intelligence leadership are chips and data, and both choke points sit inside the same region, and that region is increasingly consolidating around the idea that its digital sovereignty is non-negotiable. What happens to a country that spent years treating that region as a junior partner rather than a strategic peer? Write what you think in the comments below. And if this kind of analysis matters to you, hit like to keep the channel going. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.